Welcome, dear dreamer, to the sleeping hourglass. Tonight, we will follow Ovid, a man whose verses once charmed an empire, and whose defiance carried him far from Rome's marble streets to the cold, lonely edge of the known world. If you'd like to keep this little hourglass turning, you're welcome to subscribe. Not as an obligation, but as a soft gesture, a way of saying yes, let's keep meeting in this candlelit place. Close your eyes and step into the streets of Rome at the height of its empire. The year is the turning of the 1st century before Christ into the 1st century after. The years when Augustus, the adopted son of Julius Caesar, has taken the fractured remnants of a republic and reshaped them into a gleaming crown of order. Rome breathes in golden light. Its marble temples, once weathered by centuries of civil war, now stand polished, shining in the morning sun. The forum hums with voices, senators in white togas, merchants shouting prices, children weaving between pillars. The air is alive, yet beneath the music of the city there is a rhythm of control, of order pressed into every stone. Augustus has promised Rome peace, the Pax Romana, and peace has come. But it is not the peace of freedom, it is the peace of discipline, of law, of a garden carefully tended where weeds of rebellion are swiftly pulled away. The wars that tore the city apart are finished, but their memory lingers in the silence of watchful eyes. The empire is new, yet it stands upon ancient fears. Within this world of marble and power rises Ovid, Publius Ovidius Naso, a man not of swords but of words. Born in Sulmo, among the cool mountains east of Rome, he is drawn to the city by its promise, by its lights, by the hum of greatness that seems to echo from every stone. He is not of noble birth, not heir to a dynasty, but he carries with him a gift sharper than steel, the ability to weave language into enchantment. Rome in these years is more than politics, it is theatre. Poets are not mere writers, but voices of the age. They are guardians of memory, singers of empire, keepers of triumphs and sorrows alike. Virgil has sung of Aeneas, of Rome's destined rise from the ashes of Troy. Horace has woven odes of virtue and moderation, praising the emperor's moral reforms. Propertius has lent his voice to love and myth. In their lines, Rome sees itself reflected, disciplined, eternal, divinely chosen. Into this chorus enters Ovid, yet his song carries a different tone. Where Virgil is solemn and grave, Ovid is playful. Where Horace is measured, Ovid is daring. He writes not of empire's battles, but of its passions, not of its laws, but of its desires. His verses sparkle with wit, with a mischievous laughter that dances between lines. He is, even from the beginning, both part of the city's music and apart from it. The note that lingers out of harmony, the colour too bright for a careful fresco. To walk through Augustus Rome is to walk through contradictions. The marble gleams, but it is built upon conquest. The streets hum with trade, yet the goods flow from lands subdued by legions. The laws speak of virtue, yet whispers of scandal drift through palaces. Ovid sees this. His eyes are keen, and though he sings of love and play, he also catches the tension, the distance between the Rome Augustus builds in marble and the Rome that beats in human hearts. In this golden age, everything is polished, everything arranged. The emperor himself is like a sculptor shaping the city and its people. He builds temples to Apollo, to Mars, to remind Rome of the gods who favor him. He fills the forum with statues, each telling a story of order, of divine destiny. Even morality becomes architecture. Augustus passes laws to encourage marriage, to punish adultery, to mold private life into the image of his empire. Citizens leave beneath the gaze of their ruler not only in the forum, but in their homes, in their beds. And yet, for all its splendor, for all its peace, the Rome of Augustus is fragile. It has silence, chaos, but silence is never permanent. Beneath the order, desire stirs. Beneath the marble, cracks form. Ovid senses this too, and in his playful lines he gives voice to the city's unspoken heart. He becomes the poet of what cannot be said aloud. The yearning for laughter in a time of solemnity, the hunger for freedom in an age of control. Imagine the poet walking through the forum on a summer afternoon. The marble shines almost too brightly beneath the sun. Statues of gods and emperors tower above, but Ovid's gaze lingers on smaller things. A glance exchanged between lovers, a whispered joke among youths. The ripple of the Tiber as it carries secrets downstream. His poetry gathers these fragments, weaving them into verse. He writes not to honor Augustus, but to capture life itself, the fleeting joys that no law can bind. Yet Ovid is not careless. He knows the power he plays with. Rome is a city where words are weapons. A verse can lift a man into honor or cast him into shadow. To write in Augustus Rome is to step into a dance with power itself, each line balancing on the edge of praise and defiance. Ovid, with his wit and daring, walks that line more boldly than most. Still, in these early years, the city embraces him. His first works, the amorous, playful elegies of love, win him admirers. His voice charms the youth, who see in him not the stern morality of the emperor, but the thrill of forbidden laughter. He becomes a figure at gatherings, a name whispered with delight. Rome, at least for now, has space for his brightness. But shadows already gather. For Augustus, poetry is not harmless. It is part of Rome's fabric, part of its power. He has seen what words can do, how Virgil's Aeneid can shape destiny, how Horace's odes can praise virtue. If poetry can build an empire, it can also unweave it. Ovid's laughter, his irreverence, his freedom, these things glitter dangerously in a city that depends on discipline. The golden light of Rome is never just light. It is also reflection, blinding sharp. Marble gleams, but it hides the blood that paid for it. Peace reigns, but only because dissent is silent. Into this shimmering world, Ovid writes, and in writing, he begins to test the limits of what Rome will allow. And so, the poet stands in the heart of Augustus Rome, surrounded by beauty, lifted by admiration, but already marked by difference. His words are free, yet freedom has a price. The city shines, yet its glow casts shadows. In that delicate balance, between splendor and silence, between love and law, Ovid begins his journey, unaware of how far it will carry him. Rome glitters around him, golden and unyielding, yet in its brilliance, Ovid feels both wonder and unease. For in the very heart of order, he begins to sing of play and desire. Step closer now into the quieter chambers of Rome's soul, away from the marble of the Forum, into gardens where lovers meet in twilight, into banquets where laughter sparkles like wine, into the softer shadows where the city's heart beats faster. Here we find Ovid, a poet unlike the others, not solemn in voice, not weighed down by the duties of empire, but light like the breeze through silk curtains, like water rippling at the Tiber's edge. His verses begin with love, the amorous, poems of fleeting passion, of playful encounters, of whispered promises and broken ones too. In them, Rome hears not the thunder of destiny, but the rustle of intimacy. He does not crown generals or carve monuments in verse. Instead, he teaches how to win a glance, how to linger in conversation, how to savor the dance of pursuit and retreat. It is daring, almost irreverent. For Rome is a city of conquest, its greatness measured in provinces and victories. Yet Ovid writes of love as its own empire, its own battlefield. He makes romance a theatre of strategy, where glances are like spears and silence is sharper than swords. In his hands, even longing becomes art. The youth of Rome adore him. In porticos and shaded courtyards, young men and women recite his lines, laughing at the wit, marveling at the ease with which he turns desire into poetry. They copy his verses, carry them in memory, whisper them in secret. For them, Ovid is not merely a poet, he is a guide into the labyrinth of the heart. But the elders frown, for desire, in their eyes, is dangerous when spoken so openly. Augustus has tried to discipline the city, to root virtue in law. He has punished adultery, bound marriage to duty, pressed morality into the very bones of Rome. And now here is Ovid, spinning words that make light of restraint, that turn temptation into laughter. His poems are not sermons, they are games. Yet games, as Augustus knows, have power. The ars amatoria, the art of love, is Ovid's boldest step. No longer just poems of passion, but a manual, a teacher's voice instructing Romans in the techniques of seduction. It is playful, yes, filled with wit and sparkle, but it is also dangerous. He teaches not obedience to law, but obedience to pleasure, not the discipline of empire, but the discipline of desire. For Ovid, to love is to learn an art, to practice with skill, to master with patience. Imagine the book passed hand to hand. Young men smiling as they learn tricks of flattery. Young women blushing and laughing as they find themselves cast not as silent objects, but as participants, as strategists in the dance. The city hums with it, this playful rebellion hidden in plain sight. Yet even as his words charm, they unsettle. For Augustus, morality is not only private, it is political. The emperor seeks to build not just monuments of stone, but monuments of virtue. He wishes Rome to see itself as strong because it is pure, lasting because it is disciplined. And here comes Ovid, undermining with laughter what Augustus builds with law. A poet can be more dangerous than a soldier, for words move where armies cannot, into hearts, into memory, into the fragile spaces of the soul. Still, Ovid does not write with malice. His laughter is not rebellion for rebellion's sake. He delights in beauty, in play, in the very texture of living. He gives Rome what it hungers for but cannot confess. Release from the weight of marble solemnity, his verses are windows opened in a room too long sealed. Through them drifts air, light, the shimmer of the ordinary joys Augustus, Rome tries to discipline away. We might imagine him in the company of friends, reclining on cushions as lamps flicker, reading aloud his newest lines. The room erupts in laughter, in knowing glances. For Ovid has not only captured the art of love, he has captured Rome itself. The secret face of the city, the one it hides beneath its laws. He is both its poet and its mirror, showing it the truth it dares not admit. But mirrors can be unsettling. To reflect desire is to reveal weakness. And in a city that defines itself by power, weakness is not tolerated. Slowly, the charm that won Ovid fame begins to cast suspicion. The youth may delight in him, but the emperor listens with unease. His verses ripple outward, playful yet persistent, like water lapping at the edges of stone. and water, though soft, reshapes even marble with time. For Ovid, though, this is not yet exile. These are still the days of rising fame, of laughter, of applause. He writes with joy, with confidence, his quill moving swiftly, his wit sharp. Rome has not yet turned its back. The air is still golden, the city still his stage. Yet the seeds are planted. Augustus watches. The elders murmur. The poet, too free, too daring, begins to trouble the balance. His words have become more than entertainment. They are currents that run beneath the emperor's carefully tended order. Ovid is not blind to it. He knows the risks, yet he cannot stop. To silence himself would be to betray the gift within him. He is made to write, and to write as he feels, not as he is told. And so he continues, each verse both delight and danger, each poem a step further down the path that will carry him far from Rome. Ovid's laughter still echoes in Rome's marble halls, but in Augustus's stern gaze it begins to sound less like charm and more like defiance. For the empire's ruler is not only a man of power, but a builder of laws. The golden city does not rise from marble alone. It is built upon rules, upon discipline, upon the careful shaping of human lives. Augustus, the man who holds the empire in his hands, is not only a conqueror of armies, but a reformer of souls. He understands that Rome, broken by civil war, cannot be healed by monuments alone. It must be bound together by law, by virtue, by the appearance of purity. He steps into history not simply as emperor, but as pater patriae, the father of the fatherland. He accepts the name reluctantly, or so he says, but it fits the image he cultivates, a man guiding his people as a stern, watchful guardian. His vision stretches beyond politics into the intimate spaces of the Roman household. To govern Rome, he believes, is to govern desire itself. And so Augustus builds not only temples and theatres, but rules for how men and women are to live. He passes laws that reward marriage, that encourage the bearing of children. He punishes adultery with exile, stripping away dignity and wealth from those who break the bonds of family. He insists that Rome's greatness depends not merely on victories in battle, but on victories of morality. Picture the city in these years. Marble gleams in the sun, but beneath the surface, every home carries the weight of law. Fathers remind sons of duty. Mothers whisper warnings to daughters. Neighbors watch neighbors, knowing that scandal is not a private matter, but a danger to the entire order Augustus tries to weave. Virtue becomes public property, and intimacy, once hidden in shadows, is pulled into the light of the forum. The laws are not without consequence. Families are fractured. Marriages, once chosen for love or alliance, are scrutinized under imperial decree. Adultery, once an open secret among Rome's elite, becomes perilous. Even Julia, Augustus' own daughter, feels the lash of her father's reforms. Accused of living too freely, too scandalously, she is banished. A warning written in flesh and memory that no one, not even blood of the emperor, is above the law. Augustus Rome is a garden carefully tended. Each vine is trained to climb a certain way, each branch pruned to fit the design. Virtue is cultivated as though it were olive or vine, measured in generations, passed down as inheritance. But a garden, no matter how disciplined, is never without wildflowers, and it is here that Ovid's verses bloom, brilliant, unruly, fragrant with laughter. Where Augustus writes laws, Ovid writes play. Where Augustus seeks restraint, Ovid gives indulgence. His poems wander across the ordered rows, scattering seeds of mischief that take root where least expected. To read him is to glimpse another Rome, one not carved in marble, but beating with blood, restless, unwilling to be tamed. The contrast is stark. Imagine a citizen at a banquet. By day, he hears the emperor praise virtue, the sanctity of marriage, the solemnity of law. By night, he listens to Ovid recite verses of stolen kisses, of lovers' tricks, of playful deceit. Between these two voices, Rome itself wavers. Which is more powerful? The decree of a ruler, or the laughter of poetry that makes the heart beat faster? Augustus cannot ignore it. He knows the fragility of order. He has seen Rome collapse before, when voices of passion and ambition tore the republic apart. His empire rests on silence, on the obedience of hearts as much as armies. And so Ovid's voice, playful as it seems, carries weight. It unsettles the carefully balanced harmony, introducing a note too wild, too uncontrolled. Yet Augustus is also a man of contradictions. He claims to restore ancient virtue, yet he himself rose to power through bloodshed, through cunning, through alliances that bent every rule. He celebrates the sanctity of marriage, yet his own family is marked by scandal, his daughter Julia and granddaughter accused of indulging the very desires he condemns. In Augustus Rome, morality is both command and mask. It is the fabric that binds the empire, but also the veil that hides its fractures. Ovid, whether knowingly or not, tugs at that veil. His verses, full of wit and delight, remind Rome of what it tries to suppress. That human longing cannot be legislated. That desire slips past laws like water through a clenched fist. His poetry is not rebellion in the open sense, not a cry against Augustus, but it undermines by laughter what the emperor enforces with decree. Consider the effect of such verses. Young men learn from Ovid not just how to love, but how to defy without defying. Young women, given strategies and voice in his lines, glimpse a power not granted by law but by wit and charm. He does not stage revolts, he stages whispers, yet whispers, carried from mouth to mouth, reshape the city more quietly and perhaps more deeply than proclamations carved in stone. Augustus continues to build. He fills the city with monuments, the temple of Mars' altar, the Arapacis, triumphal arches that proclaim victory and peace. Each structure tells a story of order, of divine favor, of Rome's eternal destiny. They rise like anchors, rooting the city in his vision. Yet for every monument of stone, Ovid builds a monument of words, lighter, more fragile perhaps, but no less enduring. Marble may crumble, but verse lingers in memory, carried by voices long after statues fall. The rule of Augustus is therefore not only about the control of Rome's body, but about the contest for its soul. He commands with law, Ovid tempts with laughter. He shapes with duty, Ovid shapes with desire. The two forces coexist uneasily, like sunlight and shadow upon the same marble column. It is tempting to imagine them. Augustus in his palace, dignified, measuring laws like weights on a scale, Ovid in a garden, reclining with friends, spinning verses that make the air shimmer with delight. Two men, two visions of Rome, one stern, one playful. Both powerful, both shaping the city in ways that will last far beyond their lifetimes. But harmony cannot last. The garden Augustus tends will not tolerate wild growth forever. What begins as laughter soon comes to feel like defiance. What seems like harmless play begins to seem like threat. In time, the emperor's patience will thin and the poet's freedom will falter. For now, though, the city stands between them, marble and wildflower, law and desire, virtue and play. Rome gleams, but beneath its brilliance, a question lingers. Which voice will the city carry forward? The emperor's decree or the poet's song? And so, in the ordered garden of Augustus, Ovid's laughter rustles like wind among the vines, bright, untamed, and already dangerous. Rome is a city of marble facades and whispered secrets. By day, its streets resound with the measured weight of senators' footsteps, with the cries of merchants in the forum, with the solemn rhythm of priests carrying incense toward the temples. But by night, another city awakens, a city of laughter, music, wine, and eyes that linger too long. It is in this twilight Rome that Ovid's verses leave, travelling faster than rumour, softer than prayer, sharper than law. His ars amatoria, the art of love, is unlike anything the city has yet seen. It is not epic, like Virgil's Aeneid, heavy with duty and sacrifice. It is not moral instruction, not a hymn to Rome's gods or Rome's greatness. Instead, it is a handbook for desire, with a sly smile stitched into its lines. It tells young men where to meet women. In the circus, at the theatre, in the temples where sacred rituals mingle with longing glances. It advises them how to write letters, how to wait outside doorways, how to endure the mock barriers of women's modesty until, at last, the game of love is won. The words are playful, teasing, but also liberating. They peel away the iron shell of Rome's public virtue and reveal the warm, restless humanity beneath. For every rule Augustus writes into law, a law against adultery, a law for marriage, a law for childbearing. Ovid pens a line that slips between its cracks. He does not shout rebellion. He laughs it, quietly, in the ear of every listener, and the youth of Rome are listening. In the porticos and gardens, young men carry the little books as if they were charms. In the baths, lines are whispered between splashes of water. Women smile knowingly, seeing their own secret desires reflected back at them in playful ink. The city becomes a stage for Ovid's lessons, a theatre of love where the actors are not heroes or emperors, but ordinary hearts, trembling and bold all at once. Augustus, however, watches from the Palatine Hill with a different eye. To him, Rome is fragile, still recovering from the wounds of civil war. He has spent decades weaving peace from chaos, virtue from decay. His moral laws are the mortar in this new order, the invisible threads that hold together family, marriage, and loyalty to the state. To him, Ovid's ars amatoria is not innocent amusement, it is sabotage. It mocks the very structure upon which his Rome is being rebuilt. Imagine the emperor in the stillness of night, holding the poet's book in hand. By torchlight he reads the passages, lines that instruct women how to conceal affairs, lines that turn duty into comedy, lines that make the sacred into a playground. He does not smile. He thinks of his daughter Julia, known already for her defiance of his laws, her gatherings of lovers and friends in the shadow of his reforms. He thinks of the Senate, watching carefully for weakness. He thinks of the people too quick to laugh, too quick to follow a poet's playful voice. Ovid has done what few dare. He has taken the private murmurings of Rome and given them form, melody, legitimacy, and in doing so, he has unsettled the balance between ruler and ruled. Yet Ovid himself seems untroubled. He walks the streets like a man embraced by his city, greeted by nods and smiles, his name whispered as though it were part of the very air. He is no statesman, no soldier, yet he commands Rome through something less visible and more enduring: imagination. In every age, soldiers build empires and poets undermine them. Ovid, perhaps unknowingly, steps into this ancient dance. His laughter, though, carries shadows. He knows the danger of his own words. Playfulness is his armor, wit his disguise. But in the corners of his mind, the question stirs, how long will the emperor tolerate a voice so contrary to his laws? Ovid will later speak of a Carmen error, a poem and a mistake, as the reasons for his downfall. Some believe the art of love is the poem, its playful rebellion too dangerous to ignore. For now, however, Rome delights in the game. The contrast between marble order and human longing has never been so stark. Augustus builds temples to morality, Ovid builds verses to desire. The two visions of Rome, one disciplined, one indulgent, coexist uneasily, like two notes struck together that cannot quite harmonize. The city walks between them, uncertain which to follow. It is easy, drifting through these streets, to imagine the tension as a quiet hum beneath the clamor. A statue is raised to a goddess of chastity while, nearby, a group of young men recites Ovid's tricks for wooing her priestesses. A magistrate delivers a stern speech on the sanctity of family while his son, hidden in the crowd, clutches a copy of Ars Amatoria beneath his toga. The city smiles even as it pretends to scowl, but time has a way of magnifying small cracks. The playful lines of Ovid's poem, once heard as clever amusement, begin to sound more like defiance. The emperor's patience, long and deliberate, begins to fray. And Ovid, though still beloved, finds himself walking a narrowing road, one where each word he writes brings him closer to a precipice he cannot yet see. For every poem has consequences, and in Rome, where words can stir armies as easily as swords, poetry is never merely play. In the laughter of Ovid's verses, Augustus hears rebellion. The stage is set, though the curtain has not yet fallen. And soon, what was once playful ink will harden into the ink of exile. It begins not with a public trial, not with a clashing of swords, but with a quiet decree. A line written in the hand of power, carried from the imperial chambers into the life of a single poet. The sentence is exile. Ovid receives it not with a crowd of witnesses, not with the drama of the forum, but as a man caught in a private storm. Rome itself does not roar with scandal, no great ceremony marks his downfall. Instead, the punishment slides into place like a shadow lengthening at dusk, inevitable, inescapable. He is not to die. Augustus does not demand his blood. Death would have been swifter, and in some ways kinder. No, the emperor chooses distance. Ovid is to live, but to live far away, cut off from the city that is his soul, sent to the margins of the world. His destination, Thomis, a settlement on the western shore of the Black Sea, where Roman stone meets barbarian wind, where Latin words scatter like seeds on frozen soil. Exile is a peculiar punishment in Rome's world. It does not strip a man of life, but of belonging. It does not silence his voice, but removes it from the chorus that gives it meaning. To be exiled is to remain alive, but unmoored, to feel the heartbeat of empire yet no longer be counted among its sons. For Ovid, the decree lands like iron. His poetry had been born of Rome itself, of marble temples and crowded theatres, of gardens and feasts and the gentle scandal of whispered desires. To remove him from that soil is to uproot him from his own identity. He is to be planted in a land of strangers, where winters bite deeper than memory, and where the gods seem to turn their faces away. We imagine him reading the sentence, feeling the weight of the emperor's words. There is no negotiation, no avenue of appeal. Augustus' will is the law of Rome, and Rome is the world. The poet is granted no trial, only command. He is not sent to a place of beauty, not to Athens or Rhodes or Sicily, where exile might still carry a fragrance of culture. No, Thomas lies on the empire's ragged edge, a place spoken of in Rome with unease, as if naming a curse. The cruelty of the punishment lies not only in its geography but in its permanence. Exile is not temporary. Ovid is told he will not return. He will never again walk the Forum, never see the Tiber flowing beneath the arches of stone bridges, never hear the voices of friends echoing under porticos. He is alive, yes, but his life is divided in two. The Rome that shaped him, and the Thomas that will consume him. Augustus's sentence reveals much of his mind. He does not crush Ovid outright, he removes him. He turns the poet into a ghost of Rome, a living absence. Ovid will be remembered not only for his verses, but for the silence of his absence, the void left in the city's chorus. This too is Power's, not the sword that cuts, but the hand that pushes away, leaving the wound invisible but enduring. The poet feels the decree in his bones. He begins to write of it immediately, his verses trembling with disbelief. He calls it heavier than death, a punishment that extends life only to prolong sorrow. He pictures himself torn from the heart of civilization and cast into the mouth of wilderness. In his grief, even the thought of travel becomes unbearable. He fears the sea, the storms, the endless distance. He fears the language he will not understand, the faces that will not recognize his name. But beyond fear lies another pain, the shame of departure. For exile is not private. Rome will watch him leave. He imagines the whispers as he passes through the streets, the mixture of pity and scorn. He had been the poet of love, of wit, of charm, and now he is the condemned, the rejected, the man whose name is spoken in tones of warning. Exile is a sentence that echoes not only in his own heart, but in the city he must leave behind. And yet, Ovid is not entirely stripped. He retains his citizenship, his wealth, even the freedom to write. The punishment is not meant to erase him, but to distance him. Rome does not silence him outright, but in sending him away, it ensures his voice will be softer, less heard, less dangerous. The emperor draws a line between Rome and its poet, a boundary not of words but of miles. The decree is final. The poet cannot resist it. His sorrow begins to shape itself into verses, the beginnings of what will become his Tristia, poems of mourning, of departure, of farewell. Already, in his laments, the figure of Rome becomes both a city and a beloved. He writes of her as one writes of a lover lost, a homeland that now exists only as memory. And what of Augustus? The emperor gives no explanation beyond a poem and a mistake. He does not name the true offense, does not reveal the depth of his reasoning. The punishment falls without clarity, and in that ambiguity, Ovid is left to circle endlessly around questions he cannot answer. Why exile and not death? Why Thomas and not a gentler land? Why now, after years of writing? The silence from Augustus is a second decree, heavier than the first. Exile begins not with the journey, but with the sentence itself. In that moment, the poet already feels himself transformed. Rome begins to recede, not by distance but by decree. The familiar streets take on the hue of farewell. Every sight becomes tinged with loss. Every sound carries the weight of an ending. Even before he leaves, exile has already begun. The decree of exile is both punishment and paradox. It spares his life, but denies him its meaning. It allows him to write, but takes away the audience he craves. It makes him both citizen and stranger, Roman and outcast. And in that contradiction, Ovid will live the rest of his years. As night falls over Rome, one can imagine him alone in his chamber, the decree still fresh in his hands. Outside, the city hums as it always has, footsteps on marble, laughter in taverns, prayers rising toward the gods. But for Ovid, the world has already shifted. His Rome is already fading into memory. The sentence is not just a command on paper. It is the turning of a life into exile. The decree is written, and the poet's fate sealed, not death, but distance. Now begins the long farewell, as Ovid turns from the heart of Rome toward the sorrow of departure. The decree is given, the sentence fixed. Ovid, poet of Rome, must leave the city that had been the measure of his breath. Yet before exile carries him eastward, he wanders once more through the heart of the empire. Not as a citizen at leisure, not as a poet basking in admiration, but as a man saying goodbye. The city lies before him in its golden light. Marble temples gleam, their columns rising like frozen hymns. The forum hums with voices, traders calling, senators passing, lawyers entangling words in law. Ovid hears it all with ears sharpened by grief. Every sound is farewell. Every sight is memory pressed into the folds of his mind, to be carried with him into the silence of Thomis. He lingers in the forum, where the stones still remember the footsteps of Cicero, of Caesar, of countless voices that once filled the air with argument and decree. Here he had strolled as a younger man, exchanging laughter, trading verses, feeling the pulse of Rome beat beneath his sandals. Now he feels himself fading from it, as though the city were already erasing his presence, already preparing to forget. He looks at the rostra, where orators thundered, and wonders if his own words will still echo here when he is gone. From the forum he climbs toward the Capitoline Hill. The temple of Jupiter rises above him, a crown of stone upon the city's brow. He gazes at the god's great house, wondering if Jupiter, keeper of Rome's fate, has turned his face from him. In his youth he had prayed here for success, for recognition, for the favor of gods and men. Now he whispers a different prayer, that his verses might outlive his absence, that Rome might remember him not with scorn, but with a gentler memory. The streets are crowded, but Ovid feels alone. He passes faces he knows, friends, admirers, companions of feasts and festivals, and yet their eyes slide away, cautious, uncertain. Exile is a contagion few dare to touch. Some murmur words of sympathy, others keep their distance, as if proximity to the condemned might stain their own names. Ovid feels the cold of it. Exile has already begun, not in Thomas, but in the glances of his fellow Romans. He turns toward the Palatine, where Augustus' house stands above the city, the emperor's presence watching like an unblinking star. Ovid does not approach too near. Instead, he looks from a distance, his heart torn between anger and awe. Within those walls the decree was written, the fate of his life sealed. Yet even here, he cannot help but feel reverence for the man who shaped Rome into empire. The contradiction burns, within him loyalty and loss, admiration and bitterness. Augustus is Rome and Rome is Augustus. To leave one is to leave both. Downward he walks, to the Tiber's banks. The river flows as it always has, carrying the memory of centuries in its restless current. He watches the water glint under the fading sun, knowing that its sound will follow him into dreams. No river in Thomas will echo like this one. No current will carry the music of Rome's heart. He kneels, touches the water, and feels as though he touches the pulse of the city itself. He whispers to it, A farewell carried downstream, perhaps toward Ostia, perhaps toward the sea. Even the smallest sights draw his eye: a child playing with a wax tablet, an old man buying figs, a woman lighting a lamp before the shrine of her household gods. Rome is not only marble and empire. It is these gestures, repeated endlessly, weaving the fabric of belonging. Ovid watches them with the tenderness of departure, knowing that in Thomas, the gestures will be foreign, the language strange. He feels already the ache of distance. Though his feet still walk Rome's stones, at last he turns toward his own home. Its familiar walls, its shelves of scrolls, its garden shaded with laurel, all become relics of memory as he gathers what little he can carry. He looks upon his wife, the companion of his years, and his heart breaks. She will remain in Rome, bound to the city by duty, by family, by the impossibility of joining him in exile. Their parting is a wound deeper than decree, for love cannot be carried in bags or tucked into manuscripts. He presses her hands, promises to write, promises that his words will be her messenger across the sea. It is all he can give. Night descends. Rome glows with lamplight, streets alive with laughter and song. For others it is a city of festival, but for Ovid it is a city of mourning. He walks one last time through the quiet alleys, hearing the distant chants of priests, the barking of dogs, the wheels of carts against stone. Every sound burrows into him, an archive of memory to be reopened in exile's silence. And then, the journey must begin. His household prepares, friends gather to escort him part of the way. He steps onto the road leading eastward, and behind him the city rises, luminous and eternal. He looks back often, as though by the force of his gaze he might fix it within him forever. Rome does not stop. Rome does not weep. The city moves forward, indifferent, while one poet walks away. This is farewell, not the farewell of death, where memory softens into reverence, but the farewell of exile, where the city still leaves, still thrives. But without him, he becomes absence, a gap in the streets, a silence in the chorus of voices. Yet he knows that in some hidden way he will remain. His verses linger in Rome's libraries, in the mouths of lovers, in the laughter of youth. Even as his body departs, his words stay behind. And so, with tears unshed, he turns from the city that shaped him. Each step carries him farther into exile, but each step also roots him deeper in memory. Rome fades in sight, but grows in the chambers of his heart, where no emperor can banish it. The poet leaves Rome with eyes full of memory and a heart heavy with loss. Ahead lies the long road to Thomas, where exile becomes not just a decree, but a journey through storm and wilderness. The decree is spoken, and Rome begins to recede behind Ovid, but the true exile does not strike at once. It unfolds, mile by mile, like a wound that will not close. His road is not a single road at all. It is sea and land, tempest and silence, grief stretched across geography. Exile is not only his destination, it is the very passage that carries him there. The poet boards a vessel bound eastward, its timbers creaking like old voices. He stands upon the deck, watching the Italian coast diminish into a thin shadow. The waters of the Adriatic are restless, and the waves rise higher than he has known before. Rome is a place of marble stillness, but here the sea is a restless beast. Wind lashes, ropes strain, sailors shout into the storm as the sky itself seems to turn against him. Ovid holds to the mast and thinks perhaps even the gods mourn my leaving. Or perhaps they rejoice. The thunder makes no distinction. Night falls heavy upon the ship, black waves swallowing moonlight. He hears the sailors mutter prayers to Neptune, their voices hoarse with salt and fear. He whispers his own prayer, not for life, not for safe passage, but for memory. Let him remember Rome as it was. Let the streets of marble not dissolve in the spray of exile. The storm passes, but it leaves the poet smaller, humbled. Each landfall along the journey feels foreign, unkind. Towns speak tongues he does not know. Faces glance at him without recognition. In Rome, he could walk into a forum and be known, his verses whispered by strangers. Here, he is only another passenger, anonymous, fading. The road eastward grows colder. The sea gives way to rivers, the rivers to plains. His body tires with the distance, but his pen, when he can steady it, continues. His writing becomes a map of grief, each line marking another fragment lost. Travel is supposed to promise discovery, but for Ovid, discovery is sorrow. He finds the empire vast beyond imagining. Hills he has never seen, skies not shaped by Roman order. He realizes how small Rome is, and yet how much of him belongs to it. In every step away, he carries a Rome of memory within him. A city of the mind that cannot be exiled. Winter draws near, and with it the harshness of the northern winds. He writes of it even as he shivers, his ink freezing before it dries. Exile is not only distance, but climate, the bite of unfamiliar air, the snow that covers paths he cannot name. Tomis lies ahead, a place he has only heard of in rumour, a city at the edge of the empire, battered by the Black Sea, where barbarians raid and winters stretch long and merciless. He imagines it as he journeys, a frontier town of wooden walls, winds howling through unpaved streets, strangers speaking in harsh syllables. What place is this for poetry? What soil is this for verse? Yet he is driven there, step by step, day by day, as if fate itself drags him like a prisoner in chains. And yet, amid despair, there is still beauty. Ovid cannot help but notice it. The mountains that rise like solemn guardians, the rivers that mirror the sky, the birds wheeling over wild landscapes unbroken by Rome's marble hand. He sees a world untouched, vast and ancient, and though it does not comfort him, it humbles him. The empire is not all. There are lands older than Rome, winds stronger than its legions, and waters that obey no law. Perhaps exile is meant to teach him this. He writes again that even stripped of the Forum, the Palatine, and the Tiber, he is still a poet. His ink, trembling on the page, is proof that Rome still flows within him. His verses, once sung in courts and gardens, now travel with him like faint companions. They soften the road even as the road breaks him. Nights on the journey are long, broken by the cold and by memory. He dreams of friends who no longer walk beside him, of Augustus whose silence weighs heavier than the storm, of the city whose lights burn far behind him. He wakes to darkness, to frost, to the endless east. And yet he continues, because there is no turning back. For Ovid, the journey is a slow erasure. The farther he goes, the less of Rome remains within reach, and the more the shadow of Thomas grows. But it is also a slow revelation, that even as Rome is stripped away, the core of him endures. He cannot stop seeing in metaphor, cannot stop shaping sorrow into rhythm. The world, though cruel, still speaks in symbols, and he still listens. The road to Thomas is not a line, but a wound, a scar carved across his life. Yet scars, too, are stories. And so he writes them down, one by one, as if by recording each step he can lessen the burden of taking it. At last, he sees the final horizon. The air is sharper, the land flatter, the sea darker than he has ever known. Somewhere beyond, Thomas waits, not as Rome waits, not as a lover or a friend, but as a sentence fulfilled. The road ends there, and yet for Ovid, it also begins. For in exile, he is not finished, he is only transformed. The road delivers him to Thomas, yet the greater journey lies ahead, the task of living, writing, and enduring in a place meant to silence him. And so, as the gates of that distant city come into view, another question rises. How does a poet make a home at the world's edge? The sea is not the sea he once knew. In Rome, the Tiber moved with gentle familiarity, carrying barges and reflections of temples along its golden course. But here, on the edge of the empire, the waters are restless, black with storms, wild with winds that seem to shriek rather than sing. The Black Sea does not welcome him. It presses against the shore of Thomas like an untamed beast, heaving and snarling, as if reminding the exile that he has been cast beyond the world he loved. The town itself lies under a sky that feels too wide, too bare. Thomas is not Rome. Its walls are rough, its streets uneven, its people dressed in ways strange to his eyes. The citizens speak in tongues that tumble out in harsh syllables, clipped and guttural, unlike the music of Latin verse. When Ovid listens, it is as though the very air resists poetry, and yet he cannot help but observe, even here, even now, the habits of the poet cling to him like breath. He notices the way the wind carves, ripples through fields of coarse grass. He sees children darting along the shoreline, fearless before the cold, their laughter cutting through the roar of the sea. He hears the beat of hooves in the distance, riders sweeping over the plains like shadows. These are not the marble visions of Rome, yet they press themselves into his mind, demanding transformation into words. The winters are merciless. Snow falls like a heavy curtain, cloaking the land in silence. Ovid's bones ache beneath the cold, his body unaccustomed to such relentless frost. He recalls the warmth of Roman villas, where even in December one could walk under porticos and feel the sun. Here, the cold does not merely touch the skin. It enters, it lingers, it dwells in the marrow. He wraps himself in furs, foreign garments that feel awkward on his once celebrated frame. His ink thickens in the chill, his hand stiffens around the quill, and yet he writes. He writes because it is the only way to remain himself. Without poetry, exile would consume him. The silence of Thomas would devour his name, leaving him a husk on the frontier. And so, he bends to his task as if it were survival itself. Each line is not merely art. It is resistance, it is memory, it is breath. The people of Thomas, half curious, half indifferent, begin to notice the Roman who spends his nights hunched over parchment. To them, he is not the great Ovid, master of the metamorphoses, singer of love. He is only a man abandoned by his emperor, a wanderer who clings to words. Some pity him, others regard him as a relic, fragile and strange. Yet Ovid persists. He does not wait for their admiration. He writes for Rome, for the friends across the sea who may still unroll his verses and remember him. In these moments, his grief becomes shape, his sorrow takes form. The Tristia, the Epistolae ex Ponto, works born not of laughter or delight, but of endurance. Each poem is a wound made legible, each elegy a bridge flung desperately toward the city he can no longer touch. His Latin, polished and luminous, flows despite the roughness around him, like a stream of light through cracked stone. Still, the contrast gnaws at him. Rome had been the world's heart, marble forums, gleaming in the sun. Temples filled with the murmur of prayer, streets alive with argument and laughter. Thomas, by comparison, feels ghostly, a skeleton of a town propped against the Black Sea. Its markets are sparse, its gods foreign, its air heavy with the scent of salt and blood. Ovid writes of barbarian raids, of arrows that whistle across the plains, of neighbours living in constant vigilance. Here, life is raw, survival uncertain. For the poet of desire and playful wit, such a place feels like death while living. The Rome he once knew is a dream always at his lips, a vision that visits his sleep, only to vanish when he opens his eyes to this edge of the world. His pen aches for the language of love, but instead it finds itself sketching landscapes of desolation. He becomes the poet of frost, of longing, of silence. His exile transforms not only his surroundings, but the very timbre of his voice. Yet, even here, he discovers strange revelations. For the first time, he writes not for emperors, nor for the fashionable salons of Rome, nor for the approval of rivals. He writes for survival, and in doing so, he writes with a purity he had never known. Each verse is stripped of ornament, trembling with sincerity. There is no audience but absence itself. Perhaps this, he wonders, is poetry in its truest form, when it ceases to be performance and becomes prayer. He does not cease to plead. Letter after letter sails across the waters toward Augustus and later toward Tiberius. He begs for pardon, for mercy, for a return to the city of his heart. Each poem is a supplication wrapped in rhythm. Each metaphor is both beauty and bargaining. And yet, the replies do not come. The silence stretches longer than the sea. Even so, the act of writing holds him. It is the thread that binds him to his former self, the lifeline to a Rome he may never touch again. His words become his Rome. Every elegy a marble column, every stanza a flowing fountain, every metaphor a doorway back into the world he lost. And so Thomas becomes both prison and muse. The harsh winds etch themselves into his lines. The foreign tongues, incomprehensible to him, echo in his verses as shadows of sound. The endless winters lend his elegies their aching weight. Exile, though cruel, provides him with a new palette, the colours of longing, regret, endurance, and transformation. The edge of the world is not the end of poetry. It is its reshaping. It is where laughter turns to lament, where joy dissolves into endurance, where the poet who once taught the arts of love now teaches the art of survival. And in this transformation, Ovid himself becomes a living metamorphosis, mirroring the tales he once so joyfully composed. Rome will not see him return, but his verses, carried by wind, wave, and parchment, will one day travel back to the city that banished him. They will drift into hands he cannot imagine, into centuries unborn. Thomas may have felt like death in life, but it is here that Ovid gives birth to something that will not die. The poetry of exile, the eternal voice of a soul torn from home. And so, on the edge of the world, Ovid writes against silence, his grief crystallized into words that outlast frost and sea. Yet each line, each letter, is also a bridge reaching back toward Rome, pleading for an answer. The sea lies between him and everything he loves. Every wave is distance, every swell another measure of absence. The Black Sea crashes against the shore of Thomas, cold and indifferent, yet Ovid imagines it as a messenger. If words can travel faster than ships, if parchment can cross what his body cannot, then perhaps he is not wholly cut away. And so he begins to write. In the dim light of his chamber, the quill scratches like a heartbeat. Ink pools, freezes slightly in the winter air, and still he bends to his task. His hand is stiff with cold, yet urgency drives him. For each letter is more than communication. It is survival. He writes first to those closest, to his wife, whose loyalty is the thread binding him still to Rome. He pours into her letters all that he cannot speak aloud, his yearning, his apologies, his gratitude for her faithfulness. He calls her his anchor, his last remaining joy, the figure who might yet intercede with friends and patrons to soften the emperor's judgment. Each phrase trembles between love and despair. He knows she walks streets where his name is whispered with caution, yet still she stands beside him, even from afar. To her he sends not only news of his health, but the sighs of a heart undone. Then come the letters to friends, to men of letters, fellow poets, patrons whose influence might yet sway power. To them he writes carefully, weaving petitions with elegance, cloaking desperation in the dignity of verse. He reminds them of shared days in Rome, evenings of recitation, laughter spilling across gardens. The pride they once held in shaping Latin into music, he asks them, gently, almost shyly, to remember him not as an exile, but as a poet, as a friend. His lines are chains of memory reaching across sea and time. And then, with trembling boldness, he writes to Augustus himself, the emperor who once admired his work, who had extended favor, now has cast him aside. How does one address the hand that both nurtured and destroyed? Ovid chooses humility. He bows in ink where he cannot in person. He admits fault, confesses guilt, though the true cause remains veiled in silence. He speaks of his poem, Ars Amatoria, as reckless, foolish, unworthy of Rome's moral rebirth. He begs forgiveness. Again and again, his verses bend toward mercy, pleading for a recall, for even the faintest lessening of punishment. He writes as if each syllable could unlock a gate. Each letter is a bridge, fragile, uncertain, built on hope. He knows the dangers, that his words may not reach their destination, that the sea may swallow parchment, that even if they arrive, they may be dismissed, unread, or burned. Yet he writes, for to stop writing would be to surrender wholly to silence, to accept exile not only of body but of voice. The Tristia, his sorrows, begins as such letters. In them, he shapes his grief into poetry, sending not just pleas but crafted laments across the waves. He pictures his verses being unrolled in Roman villas, read by lamplight, whispered among the elite. Perhaps a senator pauses over a line, struck by its beauty. Perhaps a woman sighs at his longing, moved to pity. Perhaps Augustus himself, weary after governing the world, might glance upon a stanza and feel the weight of human sorrow. But Rome is distant, and distance has its own silence. The letters he sends rarely bring answers. The replies that come are cautious, brief, wrapped in the careful neutrality of those who dare not entangle themselves in imperial displeasure. His wife's words, though loving, are edged with sorrow. She cannot promise what she does not control. Friends assure him of their remembrance, but cannot promise intervention. And from Augustus, the great hope of every letter, comes only quiet. The emperor is not moved, or if moved, he does not show it. The gates remain closed. The decree remains firm. Ovid's bridges fall into the water, their arch is broken by indifference. Yet still he writes, because writing is the only way to breathe in exile, because the act of putting ink to parchment is both resistance and prayer. Sometimes he imagines his letters as ships. The quill is his oar, the parchment his sail, the ink his wind. Each completed work sets forth across the sea, carrying a fragment of his soul, Some he envisions arriving safely, some lost in storm, some drifting endlessly, unread. But even those lost letters are not wasted, for in writing them, he has kept alive the memory of Rome within himself. The people of Thomis do not always understand. They see a man writing as if to ghosts, pouring himself into scrolls that may never return. To them, the exile's task is survival in harsher terms, fending off raids, enduring winter, keeping livestock alive. Ovid's letters seem fragile, almost foolish against the rawness of frontier life. But Ovid knows otherwise. Words, even unanswered, hold the power to outlast sword and frost. The letters become more than petition. They become confession, reflection, memory. In them, he unrolls Rome as it was: the marble, the laughter, the festivals, the theatres, the hum of life in the forum. Each scroll he sends is not only a plea for pardon, but a vessel of remembrance. By writing Rome onto parchment, he resists the erasure of exile. There is tenderness, too, in these letters. He writes of birds and seasons, of small daily moments in Thomis. The way the dawn rises pale over the sea, the way snow buries rooftops until they look like tombs. These details become gifts for those far away, a way of sharing his exile not only in sorrow but in texture, in lived reality. Perhaps, he hopes, they will see him more clearly and pity more deeply. But pity is not pardon, and Ovid feels this wound each time silence answers his words. It is as if he casts prayers into the sky, only to watch them fall like stones. The distance between him and Rome grows not only in miles, but in unanswered hopes. And yet, even knowing this, he cannot stop. His letters are as essential as breath. For in the scratching of quill against parchment, in the trembling lines sent out across the sea, he remains what he always was, a poet. And though exile has stripped him of Rome's stage, it has not taken from him the stage of the page. The letters multiply. They become his legacy of exile, the ink-stained record of a man who refused to vanish into silence. Through them, he leaves to future ages not just a cry of pain, but a testament of endurance. His poetry becomes both plea and monument, fragile and eternal all at once. And so the letters sail out across the waters, fragile ships of ink seeking shores that may never receive them. Yet with each one, Ovid holds back the tide of oblivion. The snow presses heavy against the roof of his dwelling in Thomis. Winds cry along the Black Sea, tearing across the barren plain. Inside, the poet bends over his parchment, and grief becomes script. These words will gather into a book. A river of sorrow he names the Tristia, Sorrows. The title is simple, but the weight it carries is immense. In every stanza lies a fragment of his heart, breaking yet refusing to disappear. The Tristia is not merely poetry, it is an autobiography of exile, a confession, a journal, a monument. The words, like frost upon glass, reveal the patterns of a soul caught between memory and despair. Ovid does not write as he once did. The playful wit of the amours, the mischievous instruction of the ars amatoria, the bright transformations of the metamorphoses. These belong to another life, a life walled within Rome. In Thomis, joy is a ghost. Here, sorrow is the only muse that visits. And yet, sorrow is faithful. Sorrow arrives each day, sits beside him, guides his hand. The Tristia begins with departure. He recalls the moment of leaving Rome, the night when his steps carried him away from the city that had once been his world. He writes of the tears that streamed down his face as he bid farewell to familiar stones, of the ache in his chest as the city grew smaller behind him. It is not history written as record, it is history written as wound. He remembers the voyage, the violent seas that seemed to mirror the turbulence of his fate. He describes the tossing of the ship, the terror of storms, the cries of sailors. And in those lines, the sea itself becomes an accomplice to exile. The waters that separated him from Rome became not passage, but punishment, stretching endlessly between hope and despair. Yet as the verses unfold, grief deepens into something more than memory. It becomes a lens through which he sees all things. The winters of Thomas are colder because Rome is warm in recollection. The speech of barbarians is harsher because Latin in his mind is music. Every lack becomes magnified by remembrance. And so he writes of Rome as if it were a dream he had awoken from too soon. He speaks of its marble streets, of the shade of its porticos, of the bustling life of its forum. These images rise like visions, shimmering, but each one is accompanied by the ache of absence. The Tristia is full of this tension. Beauty remembered, pain endured. The grief is not only for place, but for people. He writes to his wife, thanking her for her constancy, lamenting the gulf that keeps them apart. He writes to friends, to fellow poets, to patrons who once shared his company. His elegies are not only to Rome as city, but to Rome as community, as fellowship, as a chorus of voices. Exile is not only the loss of land, but the loss of belonging. Sometimes his grief turns inward. He blames himself. He speaks of his two crimes, the poem and the mistake. He lashes at his own recklessness, wonders why he allowed pride, wit, or curiosity to carry him into danger. In these stanzas, sorrow shades into regret. His own pen, once a source of triumph, feels like the instrument of his downfall, and yet, even within the sorrow, beauty persists. His language retains its elegance, its rhythm, its music. Pain does not dull his artistry, it sharpens it. The lines of the Tristia are smooth, carefully turned, each lament sculpted with precision. In Rome, poetry was craft. In Thomas, poetry is survival. But in both, it is art. There are moments, too, of quiet defiance, though he bows in ink before Augustus, begging forgiveness. His poetry cannot help but assert the dignity of the poet. Even in exile, his voice cannot be silenced. The emperor can banish the man, but he cannot banish the words. In this sense, the Tristia is not only lament, it is resistance disguised as grief. The work grows into 5 books, each one heavy with sorrow. They spread beyond Thomas, reaching Rome, carried in letters, in copied scrolls. They enter the hands of friends, the libraries of readers. The poet is absent, but his voice continues. The irony is sharp. In being silenced, he speaks louder. In being absent, he becomes present in every place his verses travel. The Tristia becomes not just personal memory, but universal lament. In it, readers find the shape of longing, the ache of separation, the struggle to endure distance. His exile becomes a mirror for human sorrow itself. To lose what one loves, to remember what cannot return, these are griefs shared across ages. And still, the writing does not end. The Tristia is only the beginning. More letters, more elegies, more fragments of grief flow from his pen. His exile is long, and sorrow does not exhaust itself quickly. He finds endless new shades of longing to unfold. His grief becomes eternal ink. As the years pass, Thomas begins to sink into his verse. The harsh winds, the unfamiliar speech, the endless winters, all of these enter the fabric of his poetry. His sorrow becomes both Roman and foreign, both memory and present struggle. The Tristia is not only a book of exile, it is exile made permanent in poetry. And so he continues line after line, elegy after elegy, as if by writing he can delay the final silence. The pages become his companions, the scrolls his confidence, the ink his lifeblood. He cannot return to Rome, but Rome, through his words, returns to him. The Tristia leaves Rome with a portrait of grief that cannot be silenced. Sorrow carved into verse, absence transformed into music, yet in Rome itself there is no reply. The sea carries his letters, but it does not carry back replies. Each scroll released into the uncertain hands of couriers, each word pressed into wax and hope, floats toward Rome like a fragile bird in a storm. And yet, when the waves return, they bring only foam, only absence. Ovid waits. He waits as snow gathers on the eaves of Thomas, as the barbarian horsemen ride past with their bows glinting, as the sea freezes hard enough to bear men walking across it. In every season, he waits for a letter from the emperor, an absolution, a reduction, even a word. But nothing comes. The silence is not a simple neglect. It is not the silence of someone too busy to answer, nor the silence of a letter lost on the road. It is a silence chosen, sculpted, sharpened. For Augustus has chosen silence as his punishment, the way a judge might choose the axe. Only this blade cuts slower, with each passing day of unacknowledged pleas. For a poet who once lived by the responsiveness of others, by laughter at his witty lines, by applause in theatres, by whispered gossip carried through Roman streets. The absence of reply is unbearable. It is not only exile of body, it is exile of voice. The Tristia, the letters in verse, the endless pleas all drift into a void. Ovid's friends in Rome still write sometimes, cautiously. Their letters arrive with hesitations pressed into every phrase. They speak of loyalty, of missing him, of pity, but rarely of politics. For they too are trapped in the emperor's silence. To advocate too loudly for Ovid would be to risk their own downfall, their own banishment. Rome has learned well that to speak out of turn is to court ruin. Thus, Ovid becomes a ghost in correspondence, present, but fading, heard but not answered. There is something heavier in silence than in speech. An insult can be countered. A command can be obeyed. But silence is bottomless. It leaves the sufferer to invent, to imagine, to gnaw upon possibilities. Does Augustus still think of him? Does the emperor despise him more with each passing year? Does he intend mercy, withheld only for a season? Or does he wish simply to erase Ovid, to let him linger nameless in a corner of the empire until even memory forgets? The silence itself becomes a second exile, a landscape bleaker than the frozen shores of the Black Sea. In the dark of night, Ovid writes, and then he tears the words apart. He wonders if his petitions reach Rome, or if some cautious hand burns them before they arrive. He wonders if the emperor laughs at them, or if they lie unopened in some archive, neglected like dust. In truth, Augustus has no need to read them. Silence itself has done the work. History teaches us that rulers punish in many ways. Some send soldiers. Some build prisons. Some make examples in the public square. But Augustus, ever the master of appearances, chooses silence. To kill Ovid would be to acknowledge him, to respond, even in cruelty, would be to dignify him. But to withhold entirely is to reduce him into shadow, to turn him into a whisper that cannot find an echo. It is the politics of absence. A Rome ruled by Augustus thrives on spectacle, on triumphs, on monuments. To exile Ovid and never answer him is to turn him into an invisible monument, a warning that cannot even be spoken aloud. Every senator, every poet, every courtier knows he is gone, but none dares to ask why. Ovid, who once gave Rome her gossip in verses of seduction, is now himself gossip, but hushed and uncertain. He becomes less a man than a cautionary tale, his silence contagious. When Augustus dies, Ovid allows himself a breath of hope. The mantle passes to Tiberius, a man of darker temperament, but still, new rulers often seek gestures of mercy, small acts that distinguish their reigns. Perhaps Tiberius will recall him, if only to reverse his predecessor's judgment. Again, he writes. Again, the quill scratches in candlelight. Again, words of plea, of justification, of mourning are sent across the sea. And again, silence. For Tiberius is no man of pardons. His Rome is a Rome of suspicion, where every whisper is a threat, every laugh a plot. In such a climate, mercy toward a banished poet is unthinkable. Tiberius has no interest in reviving Ovid's name, in recalling him to the city where he once thrived. Silence continues, thicker, heavier. It is as though the silence itself has grown imperial, passing from Augustus to Tiberius like a crown. Ovid grows older. His beard whitens, his health weakens. Still, he writes, though less with hope now and more with resignation. His letters to his wife, to his friends, carry traces of weariness. He knows the silence will not lift. And yet, he continues to send words into it. Why? Perhaps because words are all he has left. Silence may reign in Rome, but within Ovid's small dwelling in Thomas, the scratch of a quill still pushes back against oblivion. If he cannot make Augustus answer, if he cannot make Tiberius respond, he can at least carve his own voice into history, trusting that time itself will be kinder than emperors. It is a gamble he cannot see fulfilled. But centuries later, we see it clearly. The silence of Augustus is long gone, but the words of Ovid remain. Silence is often thought of as empty, but in truth it is full. It is full of tension, of fear, of the unsaid. Ovid comes to know this fullness too well. He lives in it, breathes it, writes from within it. His poetry of exile is shaped not only by the cold winds of Thomas, but by the colder winds of imperial silence. In his verse, silence becomes sound, the absence of Rome becomes the presence of grief. He learns to bend absence into expression, to let the hollow chamber of unanswered pleas amplify his sorrow until it fills the page. And so, paradoxically, the emperor's silence gives Ovid his most enduring voice. The poet grows wary of asking. His quill still moves, but the fire of petition cools. His letters no longer beg so much as they record. He is not writing to persuade Augustus or Tiberius anymore. He is writing for the future, for strangers who will read when Rome itself is dust. The silence of the emperors may have been meant as a erasure, but history turns it into a frame, a space within which Ovid's voice stands clearer. The silence of Augustus and Tiberius lingers, like a weight pressing against the poet's chest. Yet even silence cannot last forever, for beyond it lies something greater than emperos, the endurance of art itself, a whisper carried further than command or decree. The winds of Thomas do not quiet for long. They howl across the Black Sea's restless waters, sweeping dust and salt into the streets. To Ovid, Rome had always been a place of voices. Chatter in the forum, laughter on marble steps, the murmur of lovers beneath shaded porticos. But here the soundscape is foreign, thick with consonants that snap like branches in frost, with guttural syllables he cannot yet follow. At first, the strangeness feels like another punishment. To lose the language of one's world is to be doubly exiled, banished not only from place but from the comfort of words. He who once bent Latin into playful elegance now stumbles like a child before syllables he cannot master. The poet of eloquence tastes silence on his tongue, and yet the human heart leans toward connection. Slowly, Ovid begins to gather fragments, a greeting learned at the marketplace, a fisherman's term for the shifting tides, the rough cadence of warriors describing their hunts. The sounds are jagged, but they carry warmth when offered by those who share them. The people of Tomis, harsh in appearance, are not without kindness. They look upon this Roman, foreign, frail, and sorrowful, with curiosity. Some offer him bread. Some pause to listen as he, with halting words and abundant gestures, tries to speak. In Rome, Ovid had been celebrated, his verses carried like secrets on the lips of the young. In Tomis, he is something smaller, a guest, a stranger, a man to be pitied. But in this shrinking of stature, something curious unfolds. For the first time, Ovid knows what it means not to be surrounded by empire's grandeur, but by the fragile bonds of shared humanity. He writes of the landscape, of fields stretching wild, of winters that seize the earth in iron grip, of skies unbroken by the monuments of Rome. He sketches in verse the outlines of Scythian riders, their cloaks fur-lined, their horses braced against cold. He observes the women of Thomas drawing water, their laughter sharp, their resilience plain. Each description softens his exile. The world he had called barbarous begins to pulse with life, and life demands to be written. There are evenings when he gathers with locals by the shore, when fire crackles and stories are exchanged. Their tales are of spirits in forests, of battles against neighboring tribes, of ancestors whose courage is remembered in song. Ovid listens, though much is lost in translation. Yet tone speaks where words fail. The rise and fall of voices, the widening of eyes, the laughter that bursts without restraint, these are languages he can understand. And in return, he offers fragments of Rome. He recites lines of his earlier works, though fewer understand them. His rhythm, however, carries something beyond comprehension, a cadence that soothes, that sparks wonder even when meaning is lost. In such moments, Ovid realizes that poetry is not confined by borders or decrees. Its essence flows beneath language, like water beneath ice. He becomes both Roman and exile, suspended between worlds. To the people of Tomis, he is no longer wholly foreign. To Rome, he is no longer wholly its own. This in-between state reshapes him. Once he wrote for recognition, for delight, for reputation among the elite. Now he writes as one who must stitch meaning into solitude, who must find a home within words when none exists in stone. Winter presses hardest, and in those months Ovid feels the sting of exile most. Yet even then, neighbours bring him warmth, the cloak, a flask of heated wine, an invitation to share shelter against the storms. These acts are not grand, but they are steady. And Ovid, who once chronicled the fleeting arts of seduction, begins to write of endurance, of love not as passion, but as the simple kindness that keeps one alive when far from all else. His letters to Rome continue, but alongside them now are verses that speak of Tomis, of a land once cursed in his lines, now rendered with reluctant affection. He does not forget the ache of distance, but he begins to see exile not only as punishment, but as transformation. Just as he once wrote of gods who change shape, Daphne into laurel, Narcissus into flower, so too he changes. The Roman poet becomes a borderless one, carrying in his verse the mingling of two worlds. When spring breaks the snow, He walks the hills and feels a flicker of belonging. He watches children chase one another with shouts that once were incomprehensible but now are half understood. He sees how the sea, even at empire's edge, reflects the same light that once bathed the Tiber. The earth beneath his feet, though distant, is still earth. The sky above him, though colder, is still sky. And so his poetry shifts. Where once it was playful, now it is layered with sorrow, gratitude, and observation. It holds the cadence of both Rome and Thomas, of marble and mud brick, of Latin's elegance and foreign tongue's resilience. Exile has not silenced him. It has given him another register. He is no longer only a Roman poet. He is something more fragile, more enduring, a poet of distance, of meeting points, of strangeness that becomes familiarity. And so, among strangers, Ovid begins to find a kind of home, not in marble, but in memory, not in empire, but in the shared warmth of human lives. In the quiet hours of Thomas, when wind rattles shutters and the sea groans against the shore, Ovid sits with quill in hand and candle burning low. Once his lines had danced like laughter, light-footed and mischievous. Now, the ink falls heavier, carrying not wit but weight. He sees himself not merely as a man exiled, but as a figure caught inside the very transformations he once described. He remembers the voices of his metamorphoses. Nymphs fleeing into trees, men hardened into stone, women dissolved into rivers. He had written of them with delight, weaving their fates as if transformation were a game, a theatre of wonder. But now he understands transformation differently, not spectacle, but necessity. The exiled body must change to endure, the grieving heart must shift to survive. The poet who once claimed mastery over stories now finds himself mastered by his own. The Ovid who lived in Rome had been golden witty at banquets, admired by youth, notorious in whispers. He had been a mirror for the city's desires, shaping seduction into craft, turning private impulses into public performance. That Ovid does not vanish, but he fades, as if swallowed by the frost of exile. In his place rises another pale, deliberate, wary yet sharper in vision. The poet of play becomes the poet of sorrow. Transformation begins in language itself. Latin remains his anchor, but it feels changed, as though distance has frozen its edges. He tries to coax it into song, but the music bends toward lament. His words fall not into the rhythm of flirtation, but into the cadence of mourning. His verses in the Tristia and Epistulae ex ponto breathe with sighs, their structure less polished, their urgency more raw. It is not the Latin of salons and marble steps, but the Latin of yearning. A tongue pressed against silence, he begins to compare himself to the very myths he once shaped. To Philomela, silenced and transformed, weaving her grief into fabric, to Io, wandering in unfamiliar shapes and lands, to Orpheus, whose song lingers at the edge of worlds unanswered. Exile gives him new kinship with these figures. He sees in their sorrows a mirror of his own, and in that mirror he writes with a darker empathy. But transformation is not only sorrow, it is also expansion. The poet who once drew boundaries around Rome now stretches beyond them. His eye lingers on the people of Thomas, their resilience, their rituals, their endurance against a harsher world. Once he might have dismissed them as barbarians. Now he finds their lives worthy of verse. Exile has stripped him of Rome's arrogance, teaching him that beauty resides even in landscapes the empire disdains. His poetry, once confined to the capital's walls, now stretches across frontiers into wind-beaten hills and snow-dusted shores. In letters that travel across the Black Sea, Ovid confesses his metamorphosis. He writes to friends, to his wife, to anyone who will hear him, describing his state as both diminished and remade. He is no longer the Ovid they knew. The playful smile is gone. The carefree indulgence of youth has hardened into reflection. Exile has pressed him into seriousness. And though he longs for pardon, he also begins to see that exile has carved into him something Rome never could, depth born of loss. At times he wonders if this is the true punishment Augustus intended. Not merely removal from Rome, but a rewriting of the man himself. For what could wound a poet more than to be turned into his own subject? Ovid, the shaper of myths, has become myth-like. His life stands as another cautionary tale, a living fable, the poet punished for song, the man transformed by sorrow. Even his sense of time alters. In Rome, days rushed in a blur of banquets and obligations, of verses polished and performed. In Thomas, time stretches, winters that last like eternities, nights that echo with the same wind hour after hour. This slowness forces introspection. He watches the seasons turn with the patience of one who cannot leave. Transformation is slow, like the wearing down of stone by water, like the gradual bending of a tree toward light. And in that slowness, Ovid learns a different form of artistry. No longer is poetry a game of cleverness, but a vessel for survival. Words become the way he keeps Rome alive in memory, the way he binds himself to friends far away, the way he resists the erasure exile intends. Each poem is not just an act of creation, but an act of endurance. It is in exile, paradoxically, that Ovid's work achieves a new kind of immortality. His sorrow makes him timeless. For what reader does not know longing? What heart has not felt the ache of absence? In Ovid's exile, generations to come will hear their own separations and griefs. His transformation, painful as it is, becomes the root of his permanence. The locals, too, sense his change. They may not understand the weight of Latin verse, but they see the man walking shorelines at dusk, lost in thought. They notice the Roman who no longer sneers at their ways but listens, who no longer clings only to the past but begins to weave the present into words. They witness the quiet dignity of a man remade by sorrow, and though they cannot name it, they respect it. Perhaps the deepest transformation is inward. Ovid begins to release the illusion of control. In Rome, he had believed himself untouchable, his wit a shield, his fame a fortress. Exile shows him the fragility of such walls. Kings can banish, empires can silence, but within that silence, there remains a space no power can touch, the soul's ability to shape meaning. Here, Ovid discovers the essence of poetry, not applause, not reputation, but the simple act of shaping breath into word, sorrow into song. Thus Ovid, who once wrote of gods and mortals changing form, now leaves that truth. He is no longer merely a poet of Rome, nor merely an exile of Thomas. He is both, and more a poet who belongs to neither place, but to the threshold between them. He stands not in the golden light of the forum, nor entirely in the shadows of exile, but in the twilight where transformation itself becomes his dwelling. And perhaps this is the greatest irony of all. The emperor may have sought to silence him, to reduce him to obscurity. But exile has only deepened his resonance. Ovid the playful has faded, but Ovid the enduring has risen. The poet transformed by sorrow becomes the poet eternal. And so, like his own myths, Ovid is reshaped, from laughter into lament, from the darling of Rome into its wandering ghost. Yet even as he bends beneath exile, his pen does not break. The winters of Thomis do not relent. Each year they seem sharper, as if the wind itself has grown teeth. Snow buries the thresholds of houses, and the black sea hardens under sheets of ice. In those months, the world feels suspended in stillness, and Ovid's body bends under the weight of cold and time. Age creeps upon him. His joints stiffen, his breath grows shallow, and fever lingers longer than before. Yet even as his strength wanes, his hand does not rest. He keeps quill and wax tablets near his bed, for words remain the one current he cannot dam. Writing has become less a craft and more a lifeline, each line a thread binding him to memory, to Rome, to life itself. He knows that his verses may never find their way across the sea, but he writes as if they might, as if each letter might be carried by some merciful wind into the heart of the city he longs for. The act of writing, once playful, is now laborious. He dips the quill with trembling fingers, guiding ink across parchment with care, for mistakes cannot easily be undone. His letters grow larger, more uneven, as though the page itself resists the fading strength of his body. And yet, there is beauty in the imperfection. The strokes are not polished, but they are honest, breath made visible. In these late writings, his themes grow softer, quieter. He no longer pleads with the fervour of earlier years. He no longer rails against fate or implores Augustus for mercy. Instead, his words resemble farewells to friends, to his wife, to Rome itself. He writes of gardens he will never see again, of festivals whose music he still hears in memory, of the warm sun that once struck the marble of temples. His poetry becomes a series of whispered goodbyes. But there is still hope, delicate and stubborn. Ovid cannot keep from imagining that his words might outlive him. He dreams of readers yet unborn, eyes tracing his sorrow centuries hence. If Rome refuses him, perhaps time itself will not. Perhaps the future will be gentler than the present. And so he writes not only for pardon, but for posterity, planting his verses like seeds cast into unknown soil. The locals of Thomis, who have grown accustomed to his presence, see his decline with a quiet respect. They bring him wood for the fire, blankets, food. They know the poet may not last many more winters, and though they cannot read his Latin, they understand that the frail man hunched over parchment is preserving something larger than himself. They see him often at the shore, wrapped in heavy cloaks, staring at the horizon as if waiting for a ship that never comes. They do not disturb him. Some bow their heads as they pass, sensing that his solitude is sacred. In his final verses, Ovid writes of death not with terror, but with resignation. He compares himself to the fading flame of a candle, flickering, fragile, yet radiant even in its last moments. He writes of the sea as a threshold, carrying him not back to Rome, but toward another kind of home, one beyond emperors and exiles. He wonders aloud in verse if his bones will lie in foreign earth forever, denied the rights of his ancestors, or if perhaps his words themselves will carry him back to Rome in spirit, even if his body never returns. There are moments of clarity when he reflects on his life with startling calm. He remembers the crowds of Rome, the acclaim, the laughter at banquets, the thrill of being both adored and despised. He remembers the rush of crafting verses that spread through the city like wildfire. And then he remembers the silence of exile, the letters unanswered, the pleas ignored. Both memories now seem like parts of one continuous story, not contradiction, but arc. He, who once wrote of transformation, now sees his own life as the greatest transformation of all, from joy to sorrow, from abundance to scarcity, from presence to absence. Sometimes he dreams of Rome. In his sleep, he walks again along the Forum, hearing the murmur of fountains and the steps of senators. He sees the Tiber glistening in the evening sun, the statues casting long shadows. He wakes from these dreams with tears, both comforted and wounded. The Rome of his mind is sharper now than the Rome he once knew. In exile, the city has become myth, polished by memory into something eternal. And so, his last quill strokes are written not to Augustus, nor to Tiberius, but to time itself. He writes as if speaking to the ages, to anyone who might ever wonder what it means to be cast out and yet still sing. He turns his own sorrow into a vessel, fragile yet buoyant, and sets it adrift upon the waters of history. Each stroke grows weaker, but each is more precious. He knows the end is near. He feels it in the heaviness of his chest, in the slowness of his step. But he does not stop, for to stop would be to surrender, and Ovid has never surrendered fully, not to Augustus, not to exile, not even to silence. When his hand falters, he whispers verses aloud, as if to teach them to the air, trusting that air itself might carry them farther than parchment can. His voice is raspy, yet steady. In those whispered recitations, he seems almost young again, the poet of Rome reborn in fragile sound. The locals who hear him recite, though they do not understand the words, feel their rhythm in their bones. They know that something of him will remain even after the poet is gone. And in the end, that is what he seeks, not the marble of Rome, not the pardon of emperors, but the endurance of words. If they survive, then so does he. If his verses are carried across the sea, even by chance, then exile will not have erased him. His last quill strokes are not merely words, they are defiance against oblivion, a fragile but unbreakable resistance to being forgotten. The candle sputters, the quill slows, but the ink remains. Line by line, Ovid prepares himself for the silence to come, trusting that his words will speak in his stead. And so, in the dim glow of his last candle, Ovid writes against the silence of eternity, his verses drifting like fragile vessels into the unknown. Soon, the hand that guides them will fall still, and exile will claim more than his voice. Winter presses hard upon Tomis. The Danube freezes, its surface turned to glass, and the Black Sea moans beneath sheets of ice. In this bitter corner of the empire, the seasons do not soften with age. Each year seems colder, the winds sharper, the distance from Rome greater. And here, in a modest dwelling far from marble halls, the poet Ovid breathes his final winters. His body weakens. The once lively man who moved easily through Rome's porticos and gardens now struggles against illness and cold. He wraps himself in furs, though the chill seeps through. His ink-stained fingers grow stiff, yet still he writes, as though each line were a shield against the creeping silence of death. His letters bear the familiar shape of longing. If these words reach you, Rome, remember me not as I died, but as I sang. There is no Roman physician to tend to him, no circle of friends to comfort his passing. His companions are strangers, fishermen, soldiers, traders who speak in accents thick with the languages of Thrace and Scythia. They know him not as Rome's darling, but as the weary old man who clings to parchment in dim light. To them, he is not a name in marble, but a neighbour, frail and fading. How different this end from what he once imagined. In his youth, Ovid expected honour, perhaps a grave on the sacred road lined with cypresses where travellers might pause and whisper his name. He thought his verses would crown him with remembrance, not exile. But the fates, who wove transformations into every tale he told, gave him his own metamorphosis, from poet of laughter to poet of lament, from citizen of Rome to outcast of its borders. Yet the poet accepts the thread spun for him. In Thomas, death will find him. He does not rail against it. His weariness is too deep, his words too many. He knows he will not see Augustus again, nor Rome's theatres, nor the marble temples gleaming beneath the Italian sun. His Rome is now memory alone, an empire glimpsed only through dream and verse. In his last seasons, he watches the horizon where sea meets sky. That endless water seems to him like a messenger, carrying his words westward. Perhaps, he imagines, a ship will bear his verses back to Rome long after his body is gone. Perhaps the ink will travel farther than the man. He places his trust not in flesh, but in letters. If nothing else remains, he once wrote, "Let my words live." The locals bury him, though no Roman rites mark the grave. No garlands, no marble epitaph, no carved laurel crown. Only earth, cold and dark, receives him. His bones rest in foreign soil, untended by family, unnamed by Rome. But in the silence of that burial, another truth resounds: he is gone. But the voice of his poetry remains, echoing like the sea that lapped the shores of his exile. Rome continues without him. Augustus has died, and Tiberius rules now. The empire stretches wider still, conquering new lands, building new monuments, celebrating triumphs that Ovid never sees. In the grand city, life moves forward, as if the poet had never lived there at all. But time is not always kind to power. The emperors fade, their statues topple, their laws dissolve. Yet the verses of Ovid endure, carried on the lips of students, scribes, lovers, and dreamers. Death, it seems, cannot silence him. His exile is final, his body left in obscurity, but his words defy the soil. They slip beyond Thomas, beyond Rome, beyond the empire itself. They travel through centuries, across kingdoms that rise and fall. They teach, they delight, they mourn. He who once feared oblivion finds a strange kind of immortality. And so, the story of Ovid closes not with a Roman funeral, but with a paradox: a man forgotten in death, remembered in eternity. His grave may be unmarked, but his poetry is a monument larger than stone, a flame no empire can extinguish. In the bitter winds of exile, he dies. In the whispers of his lines, he lives. Close your eyes and imagine that lonely grave by the Black Sea. Imagine also the students in centuries yet to come, reading his verses by candlelight, their hearts stirred by the sorrows and beauty of his words. There is no marble, no triumph, no parade. Yet there is a remembrance far deeper, a place in the human spirit where his voice never fades. The poet who sang of transformations undergoes his last. He transforms into memory, into language, into something untouchable by exile, untouchable even by death. Ovid's life fades on the cold frontier, but his voice carries far beyond it. In the silence after death, the question lingers: how will Rome remember its lost poet, and how will history hold his name? Rome continues. Streets still hum with the shuffle of sandals, markets still rise each morning with the cries of merchants. Temples still hold their incense smoke aloft in curling threads of prayer. The empire is a great machine, vast and steady, driven forward by power and law, seemingly indifferent to the loss of one solitary poet. And yet, beneath the rhythm of its life, a shadow lingers, a silence not quite explainable, like the echo of a harp whose strings have been plucked and cut short. For years, Ovid had been part of Rome's living voice. His verses had flowed through the conversations of the young, through the lips of lovers, through the halls where witty men quoted poetry as easily as others drank wine. He had been both a delight and a disruption. Now, in his absence, the air feels thinner, as though the city has misplaced a breath. In Augustus' last years, the city grows older, sterner. Marble monuments rise to proclaim victory and virtue. Pillars stretch skyward as if to hold Rome's greatness in stone. The laws of morality, the careful garden Augustus cultivated, remain in place. And yet, among the people, among the whispers carried in the baths and the shaded porticos, the playful tones of Ovid still surface. A lover may quote a line from the Ars Amatoria beneath their breath. A friend may send a letter laced with his words. Children of the next generation, who never saw him, laugh as they hear tales of the poet who once made even the emperor uneasy. It is a strange paradox. The empire enforces silence, but poetry moves like water. It seeps, it drifts, it finds its way. Ovid is gone, and yet Ovid is present. When Augustus dies, the city trembles at the shift. Tiberius ascends, colder, more withdrawn, and in his reign, Rome grows more cautious. The poet in exile continues his letters across the sea, pleading still, but the imperial reply is the same silence. In Rome, meanwhile, senators argue, generals command, new plays are performed, but his name is absent from the public lists, forbidden from the honours that might have been his. And still, in the private corners, his ghost remains. One might imagine a Roman youth in the dim light of a small oil lamp, unrolling a scroll of Ovid's Metamorphoses. The wax tablet beside him is filled with his own exercises, but his heart drifts into the rivers of story that Ovid spun. Gods who change into birds, women who become trees, boys who turn into stars. The exile of their maker is not part of the tale. In those myths, Ovid is as immortal as the deities he described. For the young, his banishment means nothing. They only hear the music. Others, though, feel the absence more deeply. Friends who once reclined at banquets with him find their evenings quieter. His wife, faithful and steady in Rome, leaves with a constant ache, half widowed by distance. She holds his letters as if they were relics, the closest she can come to his presence. Rome hums around her, but she feels what the city rarely admits, that it has lost something luminous. And so the empire carries on, reshaping itself, as it always does, but with a muted undercurrent. Ovid is not in the streets, not in the Senate, not in the theatres. Yet Rome without Ovid is not a Rome free of him. It is a Rome haunted by him. The irony is sharp. Augustus sought to control desire, to restrain love with laws, to bind poetry with silence. Yet Ovid's verses outlast the decree. What is forbidden becomes precious. What is silenced becomes unforgettable. A poem, once heard, is difficult to unhear. Seasons pass. Statues weather. Generations turn. And still, Ovid's absence feels like a kind of presence. His silence teaches the city as much as his words once did. That power can banish a man, but it cannot erase him. In the libraries of Rome, his works lie beside those of Virgil and Horace, the sanctioned poets of empire. Scholars copy them, preserving what the emperor could not destroy. In villas along the countryside, guests at feasts quote his playful lines to laughter, careful that their mirth does not carry too loudly. In whispered songs, lovers remember him as their poet, not the emperor's. And so, Rome without Ovid is a Rome split in two. the Rome of decree, which denies him, and the Rome of memory, which cannot let him go. It is perhaps the truest fate of a poet, to be most alive when he is absent. His body is gone, but his verses are everywhere. He becomes a ghost not of loss, but of endurance. Centuries from now, others will ask who Ovid was, what mistake condemned him, what empire feared him. But in this moment, in the still, living Rome of marble and noise, his presence hovers like a fragrance in the air, unacknowledged yet undeniable, for Rome continues. The Tiber flows, the markets swell, emperors rise and fall. But somewhere, always, someone is reading Ovid, someone is whispering his words, someone is feeling the quiet ache of his absence. And so the empire, for all its power, cannot escape him. Rome without Ovid is not silence, but an echo, a city haunted by the poet it cast away. Time moves forward, as it always does. The sea that once separated Ovid from Rome does not forget him. It carries his words upon the tides, flowing beyond Thomas, beyond Italy, across centuries, across empires. His body lies in the soil of exile, but his verses remain restless, refusing to stay buried. With each passing age, Rome itself transforms. The empire that once banished him grows brittle, its marble chipped by time, its legions scattered, its laws rewritten by successors who never heard Ovid's voice in the forum. Yet the poet's words endure. The metamorphoses, that vast tapestry of transformation, lives on in the mouths of storytellers, in the pens of scribes, in the eyes of scholars who copy and preserve. His exile, once a sentence of silence, becomes a story that echoes even louder. Scholars turn to the mystery, what was the horror Ovid spoke of? He had named his crimes in a riddle. A poem and a mistake. The poem was clear, the playful, dangerous ars amatoria. But the mistake, that question unfurls like smoke across the centuries. Some whisper it was knowledge of a scandal within Augustus' household. Others wonder if he saw something forbidden, a secret that could not be spoken aloud. Still others imagine it was simply the emperor's pride, wounded by laughter too sharp. No answer comes. The silence Ovid left is deeper than any speculation. And so his mistake becomes more than a historical fact, it becomes a mirror. Every generation fills it with its own fears, its own suspicions, its own understanding of power and punishment. Meanwhile, his words move in gentler ways. Lovers in medieval courts read his lines on desire, learning how passion can be both joy and peril. His heroids, those letters from mythic women to absent lovers, find resonance in the hearts of men and women separated by war, duty, or fate. A knight far from his beloved may hear in Ovid's verses the echo of his own longing. A young woman waiting may see herself in Penelope's patient lines. Through these voices, Ovid's exile softens into shared experience, and poets. Oh, how poets find him. They see in him not only a craftsman of verse, but a brother in suffering. Exile becomes a metaphor larger than geography. Dante, centuries later, imagines Ovid among the great poets of antiquity, walking with Homer and Virgil in the quiet fields of limbo. Exile, for Dante, is not merely banishment but the condition of the soul wandering from home, seeking its way back to God. In Ovid's sorrow, he finds a kinship that transcends time. Shakespeare too gathers threads from Ovid, weaving them into the fabric of English drama. Lovers who steal away into forests, transformations of identity and desire. The mingling of comedy and tragedy all bear the traces of the Roman poet who once sat in the gardens of the Palatine, writing of love's trickery. Ovid's exile, though centuries gone, hums beneath the laughter of Elizabethan stages. His sorrow becomes a hidden current in plays that end in both joy and loss. Later still, in the dark winters of European history, when writers are silenced, banished, or censored, they remember Ovid. Pushkin in Russia, Mandelstam in the Soviet night, poets scattered across continents, all look back to Thomas, to the man who endured distance with a pen. His exile becomes theirs, his longing their language. Across centuries, they do not only read him, they walk with him. The afterlife of exile, then, is not simply a legacy of literature. It is a transformation of Ovid himself into a symbol, of the artist who defies, of the voice that survives, of the truth that slips past empire. Rome, with all its armies and decrees, could not silence him, and so his absence becomes a kind of immortality. Think of it, the very punishment meant to erase him instead preserved him. If Ovid had died quietly in Rome, if he had lived comfortably, perhaps his verses would have been remembered as delightful entertainments of the Augustan age. But because he suffered, because he was cast away, because he wrote through frost and loneliness, his words took on new depth. They became not only the laughter of love, but the sorrow of loss. They carried within them the weight of survival. Exile made Ovid eternal, and so, centuries later, his story speaks not only to historians or poets, but to anyone who has felt the ache of distance. Anyone who has longed for home, anyone who has been silenced, anyone who has carried words in their heart that could not be spoken aloud. Ovid's exile is not just his own. It becomes universal. The afterlife of exile is not merely remembrance, but transformation. Ovid becomes more than a man. He becomes a symbol of the fragile balance between power and art. His story is retold in classrooms, in libraries, in the quiet reading of lovers by lamplight. His lines, copied by monks in the dim candlelight of monasteries, survive when empires collapse. His laughter and sorrow flow like a river that cannot be dammed, weaving through history's ruins. And always, the question remains why? Why did Augustus banish him? Why did silence fall so heavily upon a man whose crime was, above all, a poem? Perhaps we will never know. Perhaps that mystery is part of his immortality, for in the unanswered question lies the eternal relevance that power can punish, but art escapes. That authority can command silence, but silence itself speaks. The centuries turn. The ruins of Rome crumble into grass. The sea that once separated Thomas from the capital now belongs to new nations, new names. But wherever poetry is read, Ovid lingers. He is there in the sigh of a lover. He is there in the loneliness of a writer far from home. He is there in the questions history cannot answer. This is the afterlife of exile, not a grave, but a resonance. Not an ending, but an echo that does not fade. Exile, once meant to erase him, becomes the reason he endures. And in that endurance, we come to see the truth words can outlast kings. His poetry now waits at the threshold of time, ready to defy a king once more. The empire was vast. It stretched from the deserts of Egypt to the forests of Gaul, from the Black Sea to the Atlantic shore. Legions moved with precision, laws bound millions of lives, emperors bent the fates of nations with a gesture of their hand. And yet, for all its grandeur, for all its iron grip, there was one thing even Rome could not contain: words. Ovid's exile was meant to silence him, to cast him into obscurity, to let his voice wither against the winds of the Black Sea. But words are not so easily tamed. Like seeds scattered in soil, they sprout where one least expects them. Like water, they slip through cracks in stone. The empire could decree silence, but words travel faster than decree. They linger in memory, they echo in love songs, they whisper in the quiet hours of night. Ovid had always known this. His poetry, playful and daring, was not made for the marble halls of emperors. It was made for people, for lovers who sent secret notes, for friends gathered in laughter, for those who longed to remember that beneath the weight of empire, life could still be tender and free. That was why Augustus feared him. Power can endure much, but it trembles before words that touch the soul. Even in Thomas, Ovid knew his verses would not die. He wrote with the hope, fragile but fierce, that his poetry might outlast his body. If my name survives, he once mused in his lines, it will be through my words. And indeed, his verses outlived him, gliding beyond the reach of censors. Carried in scrolls across the empire, copied by scribes, memorized by students, cherished by lovers. Rome prided itself on order, on monuments, on laws that would bind eternity. But stone cracks, laws fade, power wanes, and the poet, once banished, walks quietly through the centuries. The metamorphoses, that sweeping river of myth, carries him furthest. In its verses, every story transforms. A god becomes a swan, a maiden becomes a laurel tree, a boy becomes a constellation. And hidden in those stories is the truth of Ovid himself, that transformation is the soul of survival. He too was transformed. From the poet of love, he became the poet of exile. From a man cast away, he became a voice that could not be exiled. His poetry was not bound to his body, nor to Rome. It belonged to the world. And so, through the centuries, his words defy kings. Medieval monks, bent over parchment in candlelight, copy his verses in the silence of cloisters. They do not live in Rome, nor in Thomas, but in Ovid's words they feel the living pulse of antiquity. They preserve him, sometimes without even realizing it, giving him a second life in ink and vellum. In Renaissance Italy, his poetry blooms again. Painters and sculptors take his myths as inspiration, filling walls and marble with scenes first told by his pen. Botticelli's brush captures Venus, echoing lines that once made Rome blush. Bernini's hands carve Daphne's transformation into stone, her fingers reaching towards sky as bark envelopes her skin. A moment Ovid had woven centuries before. The poet's banishment is long forgotten, but his imagination endures in colours, in marble, in song. His defiance grows stronger as time unfolds. In Elizabethan England, Shakespeare borrows from his stories, Pyramus and Thisbe reappearing as tragic lovers, Titania and Bottom echoing the mischief of Ovid's enchanted woods. The laughter and longing of Ovid's voice ripple through English stages, carrying his defiance into yet another empire's heart. And later, when power once again seeks to silence poets, when regimes punish dissent, when voices are exiled, when pens are broken, Ovid becomes their companion. He is remembered in Russia, where Pushkin draws breath from his myths. He is remembered by Mandelstam, who whispers Ovid's name while himself cast into exile by a modern emperor. He is remembered in every writer who feels the sting of distance and the ache of silence. Ovid's exile becomes a shared condition, not of one man in Thomas, but of all who write against the weight of power. Rome believed it could bury him, but the grave Augustus prepared was shallow. From it, Ovid's words rose and rose again, carried not by decree but by memory. His laughter still rings in the playful lines of lovers. His sorrow still trembles in the poetry of exile. His rebellion still breathes in the courage of those who dare to write despite kings. And so, even as emperors rise and fall, as cities crumble, as marble erodes, Ovid walks on. His words are not locked in Thomas, nor confined to ancient scrolls. They are alive each time a reader finds them and feels, in some quiet corner of the heart, a spark of recognition. The poet speaks, still. This is the paradox of exile, to be cast out, yet to endure more deeply than those who cast you away. Rome silenced the man. History remembers the poet, and in that remembrance, he defies not only Augustus, but every king who has ever tried to bend the human spirit to silence. The words that defied a king are not words of anger, nor of violence. They are words of desire, of grief, of longing, of laughter. They are words that remind us that power is temporary, but truth, in love, in sorrow, in art, is eternal. Rome could build its monuments, could pass its laws, could command its armies, but it could not stop a verse from finding its way across centuries. It could not stop a story from being retold. It could not stop a poem from being remembered. And so the poet, once alone by the frozen sea, is not alone anymore. He is surrounded by centuries of voices that carry his own. His laughter, his grief, his rebellion, all live on, unbroken, unstoppable. The man was mortal, but the words are eternal. In the end, Ovid's silence became louder than any emperor's decree. And now, at the threshold of memory, his voice returns once more, leading us to the gates of Rome, where the poet has always longed to stand. The night deepens, and we stand now at the threshold. We have walked with Ovid through Rome's marble streets, through laughter and seduction, through the shadow of law, through the bitter winds of exile, through letters written to the silence of emperors, through the centuries that carried his verses farther than his body ever travelled. And now we arrive where he always longed to be, at the gates of Rome, not in flesh, but in memory, not in sandals, but in words. Rome remains, its arches rise still, though weathered by centuries. Its stones bear the footprints of emperors, soldiers, lovers, beggars, poets. Among those countless souls, Ovid is both absent and present. His body lies in the soil of Thomas, far from the Tiber's embrace. But in memory, in imagination, he returns. His verses carry him, weightless as wind, to the gates he never saw again. And here is the final paradox: exile did not keep him out. Rome without Ovid was incomplete, and so Rome, in memory, let him back in. We picture him, not the young poet who once dazzled the salons with playful wit, not even the exiled man scratching out pleas to Augustus by lamplight, but the eternal Ovid, the poet who has become both ghost and guide. He stands before the city, unburdened at last by decree, waiting to be remembered. The threshold is both literal and symbolic. It is the edge of Rome, the boundary between inside and outside. But it is also the edge between past and present, between forgetting and remembering, between silence and song. For Ovid, the threshold was never only a wall, it was a question. Could poetry cross where a body could not? Could words enter where the poet was denied? The centuries answer yes. His verses, like pilgrims, returned to Rome when he could not. They passed through the hands of monks in darkened scriptoria. They were studied in the schools of rhetoric, debated by scholars, laughed over by lovers, cherished by artists. His metamorphoses became as Roman as the Forum, as eternal as the Tiber. The emperor's silence could not stop their return. So here, at the threshold, Ovid waits, and we with him. We look back across his life. the young man rising in a golden city, weaving love into poetry, the daring voice who taught seduction in a time of laws, the banished poet, bundled against winds in a city of strangers, still clinging to verse as to breath, the aging man, frail but unbroken, whose last words were shaped not in speech but in ink, and finally, the ghost of exile, wandering across time, returned in memory to Rome. What remains is a question. Was it worth it? Was it worth defying Augustus? Worth writing words that unsettled the order of empire? Worth the bitter winters of Tomis? Worth the loneliness, the silence, the unhealed wound of absence? Or would it have been better to be cautious, to bend to law, to remain safe within Rome's embrace? History cannot answer, but poetry can. The very fact that we remember him, that we speak his name now by candlelight, that his verses flow through the centuries while emperors turn to dust, that is answer enough. Ovid's exile was the price, and immortality was the reward. His words remind us that power fades, but truth endures. It is not only Ovid's story, it is the story of every voice silenced by decree, every artist punished for daring, every human being who has felt the ache of distance, the ache of exile. His poetry becomes their threshold too, a place where absence and presence meet, where silence becomes song. Rome's gates, in memory, open. Ovid enters not with sandals, but with syllables, not with a body, but with breath carried across time. The emperor who cast him out cannot bar him now. The city that silenced him cannot keep him quiet. The poet stands at the threshold, and through him, so do we. The final lesson is gentle but profound. Exile cannot last forever. Not because it ends in return, but because memory refuses to let it endure. Power can command silence, but silence itself transforms into echo. And echoes do not fade, they ripple. Ovid's poetry ripples still. It reaches the lovers who quote him, the artists who paint from his myths, the students who stumble upon his verses for the first time, the poets who find in him their own reflection. He lives wherever his words are read, which means he is never far from Rome, never far from us. And so the story closes where it began, in the twilight of Rome, where marble glows in the fading sun, where words move more freely than armies, where one poet dared to laugh at power, and where that laughter, though punished, became immortal. The man is gone. The exile was real. The pain was true. But the words endure. Here, at the threshold, Ovid's voice whispers, "It was worth it." And so we leave him. Not in Thomas, not in exile, but at Rome's gates, eternal in memory. His story becomes ours, a reminder that power passes, but poetry remains, waiting always at the threshold of time. And so the story drifts into quiet, like a tide receding into the night. We have walked with Ovid, the poet who loved too freely, who spoke too boldly, and who bore exile not as a silence, but as a final poem written against the cold. His verses remind us that while power may rule the body, it can never bind the spirit, and that words, once spoken from the heart, move through time like echoes that never fade. The candle of his story now burns low, but it does not go out. It flickers quietly in the corridors of history, its glow reaching us even now, and though centuries have passed, his voice still hums in the stillness. A reminder that truth, once set free, cannot be silenced. Thank you, dear listener, for sharing this hushed space with me tonight. Your presence here turns this simple story into something alive, something that stretches across the world, from one quiet room to another, from one heart to another. Together, We keep the echoes of history breathing softly in the dark. Now, let the weight of the day slip gently from your shoulders. Let your breath fall into a slower rhythm like waves against a distant shore. May your dreams carry you kindly through soft valleys of rest and wonder. Sleep well beneath the hush of history's lullaby, knowing that the past has tucked you in with its quiet wisdom. This has been the Sleeping Hourglass, where the past folds itself into night, and where stories become gentle companions to your rest. If tonight's tale brought you peace, know that you are always welcome to return whenever you wish to wander through time again. And so, as the last spark of this candle dims, may stillness wrap around you, may dreams cradle you, and may history whisper you safely into sleep. Good night.